We just recently finished the book of Joshua, and now just going to take just this Sunday to do a topical sermon of something that's just been on my heart as I've been doing ministry. I've been I have my own questions in my heart, so it came to this passage. Really quick context for the book of Hebrews. The book of Hebrews is written, the original audience that is, was written to Christians who had just converted from Judaism. And while these Christians did receive persecution from the outside, the danger of losing their faith did not come from persecutions, but rather from the temptations from within the church. That is the great temptation to return back to Judaism, that is a works-based religion, and to abandon Christ. And so this author, he is writing to this original audience to warn them of this form of apostasy that is unbelief. The author of Hebrews, he warns these would-be apostates that abandoning Jesus, that is the Christ, who is more superior than the angels and even Moses, and who is the true high priest, would be an eternally damning mistake. That's kind of the huge context of our passage today, the book of Hebrews. But for all our intents and purposes for today's passage, what we need to know is that Hebrews 11, the previous chapter, is what's called the Hall of Faith, and it gives us examples of faith in the Old Testament. And today we are looking at Hebrews chapter 12. The question that today's passage answers or asks is this: how do we run with endurance the race that is set before us? The question that this passage answers, just these short 2 verses, answers the very important question: how do we run with endurance the spiritual race that is set before us? As I was the EM pastor of this ministry, and today is actually my last day as staff EM pastor, the question that I had in my heart was, how do we continue to be faithful? How do we live a life of endurance so that we can faithfully complete the race that is set before us? Last week's passage, we learned from Joshua's lifetime full of faithfulness that one can endure, live a lifetime of faithfulness by looking towards the eternal rewards. That is the next generation, God's commendation, and an eternal inheritance. And in this passage, the author exhorts us, let us run with endurance. In Greek, you can identify the main verb of the passage, and here the main verb is found in Hebrews chapter 12, verses 1d, and the author exhorts us, let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. How do we run with endurance the race that is set before us, brothers and sisters? This includes ministers, this includes just the average Christian. How do we complete the race successfully, brothers and sisters? I think one of the biggest issues in the ministry is such the high turnover rate. If you would forgive me, I have run just a very short leg of this relay race of leadership, just short of 2 years, although I will continue to be a pastor here at this church, but I will not be staff. Today would be the last day I will be staff. And the question is, as we have other ministers come and minister to us, the question we have for average, everyday Christians is, how do we continue to live a life of faithfulness? 2 points for today's passage is fairly quick, although the second point does have many subpoints. Point number 1, how do we run with endurance the race that is set before us? We must lay aside ensnaring sin. The author of Hebrews teaches us that if we want to be able to run with endurance this race that is set before us, if we want to live a life of faithfulness, what we must do, brothers and sisters, is we must lay aside ensnaring sin in our life. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1b. Let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely. The illustration that the author here is using is a foot race. And this foot race is kind of held in a stadium, and he gives the very obvious suggestion that if you want to run a race with endurance, you must be as light as possible. If you run this spiritual race and you have all this baggage and you have these ankle weights of sin and you have this weight vest that is put on you, brothers and sisters, it's going to be very, very hard to run with endurance the race that is set before us. And the word cling that he uses here, it's more better described as ensnaring. More than a weight that clings to you, it's more specifically like stepping your foot into a bear trap, which ensnares you and stops your race of living a faithful life. In Western Christianity, of course, this ensnaring sin is so obvious if you would just take time to reflect upon your life. I do believe that we so conveniently rename this ensnaring sin as the American dream. Many of us have this weight on us, this ensnaring sin of looking for financial freedom, more than being spiritually free from these sins in our life. Many of us put our own comforts rather than the service of God. Many of us believe we are entitled and we deserve to build our own kingdom rather than to build the kingdom of God. This idolatry of self, this worship of self, brothers and sisters, is an ensnaring sin which will put a stop. It will bring your life of faithfulness to a crawl and perhaps even of backsliding and stopping you on your life of faithfulness. Brothers and sisters, if we want to live a life of endurance, of faithfulness, we must lay aside this American dream. Another ensnaring sin that is very obvious, that is something that even plagues me in my life, is social media. I'm sure there are metrics out there of how much time we spend on our phones, on our computers, rather than building the kingdom of God. Social media, brothers and sisters, is a very ensnaring sin if you are sober and honest about our addictions to it. Brothers and sisters, if we want to run a race of endurance, we must lay aside ensnaring sin. Just as this author is using this illustration of a foot race, of a marathon, I will also use this illustration in our present day. Next picture, please, Michelle. This is, I don't know if you can see that well. This is a Kenyan man. His name is Eliud Kipchoge. Does anyone know about him? In October 12, 2019, he did what many thought was impossible. He ran a marathon in under 2 hours. That's him at the finish line. He finished a marathon that is, I believe, 26.2 miles in 1 hour, 59 minutes, 40 seconds. I believe he attempted this first one time and he failed, and then now he was successful the second time. To achieve this, he ran an average pace of 13 miles per hour, and he would need to complete each mile 4 minutes and 58 seconds. However, this run is not recorded as an official record because Kipchoge had to lay aside every weight imaginable to meet this goal. What Kipchoge had to do was he needed to do everything to lay aside any weight that would prevent him from completing this goal on time. Next picture, please. Kipchoge, he had what was called pacers who would run in front of him, and it would limit the wind drag. Some studies of an air tunnel showed that just having pacers run in front of him to reduce his wind drag, reduced the wind drag around 83%, or saved him about 3 minutes and 33 seconds. He even took in account the weight of the wind that would push against him, that would make him not complete this race on time. Not only that, but next picture, please, Michelle. Kipchoge, he ran with these Nike Alpha Flies. These Alpha Flies are very lightweight. Not only are they lightweight, but they have a foot plate that helps you have a rolling motion forward. And also, the cushion in this shoe gives the highest energy return possible found in a shoe. Kipchoge was able to run his race and to complete this marathon because, brothers and sisters, he laid aside every weight imaginable that he could think of. Brothers and sisters, let us take a quick moment to reflect upon what are the ensnaring sins in your life. Is it your job, your workplace, your ambitions? Is it your relationships? What is preventing you, brother or sister, from running your race successfully? If we want to have any chance of completing our marathon, brothers and sisters, we must lay aside every weight in our life, every sin. Point number 2, how do we run a race with endurance? We need to look to past faithful examples. How do we live a life of faithfulness, brothers and sisters? We must look to past faithful examples. Again, point number 2 has a couple of subpoints, so bear with me, brothers and sisters. Subpoint A, we should look to the great cloud of witnesses. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1a, before the author exhorts us to run this race with endurance, he tells us to, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. What the author here is telling us is that we do not need to run this race alone. We have a whole cloud of witnesses that we could look back to and see their example, and to see how these human beings, these sinners, they were able to complete their race with endurance, and we can look at their example and be encouraged. In Hebrews chapter 11, it is what's called and known as the Hall of Faith, and the author of Hebrew shows this great list of these Old Testament saints who were able to complete their race. Even though they didn't receive their prize on this side of heaven, they did receive it on the next side. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 1, 13, and 39, we will see that how these saints were able to run their race with endurance is they had the faith that God was going to reward them in the future. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. Now, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. These Old Testament saints did not receive it, but they knew that they were going to receive it in the next life. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 13 and 39. These all died in faith, not having received the things promised, but having seen them and greeted them from afar, and having acknowledged that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. And all these things, though commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised, since God had provided something better for us, that apart from us they should not be made perfect. What is the author saying here? Let us look to past examples who lived a life of faithfulness, even though they did not receive the reward on this lifetime, because they knew the reward would be in the future. Really quick run through of chapter 11. By faith, Abel offered an acceptable sacrifice because he knew and was convicted of the things unseen. By faith, Enoch was taken up by God. By faith, Abraham obeyed the command to go. By faith, Sarah conceived. By faith, Abraham offered up Isaac. By faith, Jacob blessed Joseph. By faith, Joseph instructed Israel to carry his bones out of Egypt because he held on to the promises of God. By faith, Moses left Egypt. By faith, Israel crossed the Red Sea. By faith, Rahab welcomed the spies. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down, and so forth, brothers and sisters. As we run our race of faith, brothers and sisters, we have a whole cloud of witnesses that we could look to and to be encouraged by. If we want to run this race with endurance, let us lay aside every weight and sin in our life, and let us look to past faithful examples. Going back to the Kipchoge illustration, Kipchoge, he did not run his race alone. There were actually 35 pacers who would rotate and take turns running ahead of him. If Kipchoge ran this race alone, looking to himself and not looking to others, he would not have been able to complete the marathon in 2 hours. He had a group of people surrounding him that helped him to complete this race. Not only did he have pacers, but he also had a pace vehicle that went before him that showed him the pace he needed to keep, and it showed like a laser of where he needed to run forward. All Kipchoge had to do was look forward and keep running at what was ahead of him. He had people that were cheering him on, and his pacing set that was giving him the example forward. And lastly, as he completed, he was welcomed and he was cheered on by his friends and family, and of course, most notably, his wife. This illustration that this author gives is that as we run this race, we're in this stadium, and we're not running alone, but we're running with a great cloud of witnesses. These faithful past examples are at the finish line, and they are waiting for us to come to them, and they are cheering us on. Look how we did it. Follow our example, and you will be able to run this race with endurance. So, point number 2, look to past faithful examples. That is, look to the great cloud of witnesses. But subpoint B, let us look to Jesus. Not only do we have a cloud of witnesses of the Old Testament saints, but we have the most prime example. We have Jesus Christ to look forward to. And this author gives us 2 reasons why we can look to Jesus as an example of past faithfulness. First, we can look to Jesus because he is the founder and perfecter of our faith. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith. This word here, looking, in Greek, it's better described as fixing our eyes on. And in the Greek, in the grammar, I know I haven't preached from the New Testament as much. In the grammar, this is what's called a present participle. That is, this author is encouraging us to fix our eyes on Jesus and to keep looking at him. As we run this race, we are not to look at Jesus and then look at something else and then look at Jesus. No, we're supposed to fix our eyes on Jesus and to see how he ran his race. And that will encourage us, brothers and sisters, to also finish our race well. Because Jesus is the founder and perfecter of our faith. In this short passage, verses 1 and 2, we see a chiasm. Next slide, please, Michelle. The focus again is looking to Jesus. That is the middle of the chiasm. But what this chiasm is teaching us is that as we run our race with endurance, we are to look at Jesus who endured the cross. As we have this race set before us, brothers and sisters, we're supposed to look at the joy that was set before Jesus. And if we do these things, then we will look to Jesus, who is the founder and perfecter of our faith. Last point I want to make at looking at Jesus, who is the founder and perfecter of our faith, was that we need to run our race in such a way as Jesus did, with purposeful suffering. I believe it's on the next slide. Jesus ran the race, it says in Hebrews chapter 2, verse 10, For it was fitting that he, for whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder of their salvation perfect through suffering. What I'm going to transition here is now, Jesus, he suffered for a very specific purpose. As we look to Jesus and follow his example, we need to follow his example very specifically, not having this abstract, broad suffering, but suffering for the sake of the church, for the sake of the sons and daughters who would be brought into glory. Second reason why we should look to Jesus, brothers and sisters. Jesus is the founder and perfecter of our faith, but we should look to Jesus as an example because he, with joy, endured the cross. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2, this is Jesus, who for joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. As I was thinking about what to preach today, as kind of my last official staff EM pastor message, I heard this excerpt, and I believe it was like some random celebrity, and he was studying, I guess, the Bible for his role. And he was, I'm not sure if he's a Christian, but his interpretation of the life of Jesus was astounding to me, because what he said was, when he looked at the life of Jesus, he did see the suffering that Jesus went through. How he was persecuted, he was despised by his peers, even outcasted by his family, how he suffered through the excruciating pain of the cross. But when this guy saw the life of Christ, he did not see a life of suffering, rather he saw a life of joy. Brother and sister, beloved church, follower of Christ, when you reflect upon the life of Jesus, is what strikes you, is his suffering, or do you see through the suffering and see the joy? I feel that when a preacher, a pastor exhorts his congregation to imitate and follow Christ, what the congregation hears is that, oh, I need to live a life of suffering. But rather, I believe what we need to hear is that we need to hear that, yes, we are going to suffer as Jesus suffered, but for joy. If you see living a radical Christian life as only a life of suffering, a life of sacrifice, a life of servitude, then, brothers and sisters, it's going to be very hard to run this race with endurance. You're going to be tempted to despair and to give up. But rather, if you see that this suffering, brothers and sisters, this very purposeful suffering actually leads to joy, then, brothers and sisters, we can run this race with endurance, with optimism, and with joy. If you run this race with despair, which is the opposite of joy, brothers and sisters, that is what the enemy wants you to do. You see, the enemy, he wants to tempt you into sin, but he wants to tempt you into a place of despair. He does not want you to repent and go back to Jesus and to find the grace of God. He wants you to be guilty, to find shame, to find depression, and to despair. And that leads you away from God. But if you see that this life of servitude, this life of suffering leads to joy, then this burden is very light, brothers and sisters. If we look forward to what God has for us, that we will be seated in heavenly places, then we will even have joy when our life is plundered, when our property is plundered. Next slide, please. the original audience, they had this joy in their hearts. And the author of Hebrews commends them. He says this, Hebrews chapter 10, verse 32 to 39, but recall the former days when after you were enlightened, you endured. See, they were enduring their race of faithfulness, a hard struggle with sufferings, sometimes being publicly exposed to reproach and affliction, and sometimes being partners with those so treated. For you had compassion on those in prison. And what did they do, brothers and sisters? How were they able to endure their life of faithfulness? You joyfully accepted the plundering of your property, since you knew that you yourselves had a better possession and an abiding one. Therefore, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. For you have need of endurance, so that when you have done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. Brothers and sisters, how we are able to live a life of endurance is we need to fix our eyes on Jesus, who for joy endured the cross. And when we see that Jesus did this not for wasteful suffering, but for the joy of increasing the family of God, then, brothers and sisters, we can joyfully even accept the plundering of our property. When I moved to Flower Mound, my wife and I, we moved to Tyler, East Texas, and we moved here, I'm sure many of you know, to pay off our student loans. And then after the 2 years we paid off most of our student loans, we wanted to move back to California and to go back to our family. And at that time, so we moved 2020, and then we lived in Tyler for 2 years. And at the end of 2021, we were really considering moving back to California, but home prices were just outrageous. So we're like, all right, let's give Dallas a try. And we don't know anything about, North Texas. We didn't know where to live. And so we were just looking through what cities sounded nice. And I forgot how we came across Flower Mound, probably for its school system. And we said, oh, Flower Mound's nice. And so we would take trips to Dallas, and we would look around the neighborhood. And we would come to Flower Mound, and I remember driving on Flower Mound Road and passing this church and thinking, oh, that will be the church we go to if we move to Flower Mound. What happened is we did find a house in Flower Mound, and things happened so organically as how I wanted to serve. I wanted to move somewhere that was best location for me to go to the airport, because I traveled a lot, for Liz to find a dental practice. And so we found Flower Mound, and we bought a house next to Marcus High School. And then after we moved here, I had it in my mind, I have it set. I'm just going to go to the closest Korean church. I believe that's how we should find our church, not based on the pastor's abilities, his leading, his preaching, or the size of the church, or what the church gives to us. I believe we need to be a faithful people where God has set us in the community that he has set us. So I just went to the closest Korean church that I knew. A year later, I'll find out there's actually closer Korean churches to me, but this is the church that I committed to, and I came here in, I believe, January 2022. And the past 2 years of living in this house in Flower Mound has been a complete headache. Hugely, because I did not know what it took to live in North Texas. That is the clay. You really need to water your foundation. You need a sprinkler system. You really need good grass. Otherwise, your house was just going to keep settling and breaking. And although I know the people in this passage, they literally had people come inside their homes and plundered their home in a very odd sense. The foundation, the clay, it plundered my home here in Flower Mound. And I know from this passage and from many passages in the Bible that how you suffer is your testimony to the people around you. How you go through this suffering, whether it's with despair or with joy, will determine if you can run this race with endurance. And really, when all these crazy things are happening at my house and I'm just throwing money into this pit that is endless, looking back, I'm still so joyful for coming to this church. Despite all that craziness, I love that house brought me to this church. And through that suffering, brothers and sisters, I see joy. And I want to commend you here today, brothers and sisters, that if you want to have a fighting chance to complete your race, if you want to run your race with endurance, brothers and sisters, even through the plundering of your property, you must fix your eyes on Jesus, who for joy endured the cross. Summary, brothers and sisters. Let us run with endurance the race set before us by laying aside ensnaring sin and fixing our eyes on Jesus. I want to end with this passage. This is one of my favorite passages in the Bible. And this is an encouragement to you to suffer for the sake of others. Psalm chapter 126, verses 5 to 6. Those who sow in tears shall reap with shouts of joy. He who goes out weeping, bearing the seed of sowing, shall come home with shouts of joy, bringing his sheaves with him. Your purposeful suffering, following after Christ for the sake of others, brothers and sisters, will produce a harvest of joy. A harvest of brothers and sisters, so that when we enter into heaven, we will have even a greater family to enjoy the grace of God.